In the pale dawn of a Virginia morning in 1848, steam rises from a porcelain cup like the breath of ghosts. An unseen hand stirs the dark liquid with deliberate precision, each circular motion carrying the weight of unspoken prayers and whispered curses. The coffee is black as midnight, bitter as memory, and within its depths lies something that glitters like crushed stars, something that should never touch human lips. What if I told you that the deadliest poison isn't found in exotic plants or arcane chemicals, but in something as simple as glass, ground fine as flour, invisible as sin? In the grand houses of Virginia, where magnolia blossoms mask the stench of suffering, where crystal chandeliers cast shadows that dance like phantoms, silence has always been the currency of survival. But silence, like glass, can cut both ways. This morning, in a household where cruelty wore the mask of civility, where power strutted in polished boots across marble floors, that silence would finally shatter. For in the delicate fingers of a woman whose name history would forget, revenge had been ground to powder, stirred into morning ritual, and served with a smile that held all the warmth of winter moonlight. The cup waits. The master will soon wake. And somewhere in the shadows of that Virginia mansion, justice wears an apron and measures death by the teaspoon. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that house of whispers where every floorboard held secrets and every doorway framed a different kind of prison. The Whitmore plantation stretched across the Virginia countryside like a beautiful lie, its white columns gleaming in daylight while darkness pooled in every corner after sunset. Master Cornelius Whitmore ruled his domain with the iron certainty that God himself had blessed his dominion over lesser souls. He was a man carved from marble and malice, with silver hair that caught the light like a crown and eyes the color of winter storms. His voice could freeze summer rain, and his presence sucked the warmth from any room he entered. In the parlors of Richmond, they called him a gentleman. In the quarters where his workers slept on straw, they called him something else entirely, when they dared to call him anything at all. The house itself seemed to breathe with his cruelty. Its walls had absorbed decades of muffled cries, witnessed scenes that would make angels weep, absorbed the prayers of the broken and the desperate. The mahogany banisters gleamed with polish applied by trembling hands. The Persian rugs bore the weight of feet that never chose their own direction. Every crystal glass, every silver spoon, every damask curtain had been touched by fingers that belonged to bodies that belonged to no one but him. And moving through these halls like a ghost made flesh was she, the woman whose name the records would lose, whose face the portraits would never capture, whose story would survive only in whispers passed from mouth to mouth like contraband. She was small and dark, with hands that moved like water and eyes that held depths no one bothered to fathom. To the master, she was furniture with a pulse. To the other enslaved souls, she was something else, a keeper of secrets, a collector of broken things, a woman who smiled at his jokes while her eyes counted his sins. Every morning, she rose before dawn to build his fires, to press his shirts, to prepare his coffee exactly as he demanded, strong enough to wake the dead, black as his heart, served in the bone china cup inherited from his sainted mother. Every evening, she turned down his bed, knowing she might be summoned back before morning. Every day, she moved through his world like smoke, visible only when he needed her, invisible the moment his attention turned elsewhere. But those who looked closer, and in that house, survival depended on seeing what others missed, might have noticed something changing in her lately. Something gathering in the space behind her, silence like storm clouds behind mountains. Her movements had acquired a different quality, purposeful yet patient, like a spider spinning her web with infinite care. Why glass? Why not the rat poison? From the pantry? Or the laudanum from his medicine chest? Or simply the carving knife from the kitchen? The question haunted the household after it was all over, but perhaps the answer lay in the very nature of glass itself. Beautiful and deadly, clear and invisible, fragile yet capable of cutting to the bone. In the cellar of the Whitmore house, where shadows pooled thick as molasses and silence pressed against the walls like living things, she had begun her collection months earlier. Broken bottles discovered in dark corners, discarded glassware, cracked by careless hands, crystal stemware deemed unfit for the master's table. Each shard found its way into her possession like iron filings drawn to lodestone. The grinding was done in the deepest hours of night, when even the house's ghosts seemed to hold their breath. Using a mortar and pestle stolen from the kitchen, she worked with the patience of someone who had learned that revenge, like fine wine, improved with time. Each fragment of glass was reduced to powder finer than sand, finer than salt, finer than the dust that settled on the master's conscience. The sound of grinding glass became her lullaby, a soft, rhythmic whisper that spoke of patience and planning, of fury refined into art. Other workers in the quarters whispered that they could hear it sometimes, drifting through the night air like the ghost of chains rattling, like the echo of prayers answered by darker angels. Some said she hummed while she worked, old spirituals, transformed into funeral dirges, songs of freedom twisted into hymns of vengeance. She collected her powder in a small glass vial, no bigger than a child's fist, hidden in the space between floorboards beneath her thin mattress. Each night, she would add a little more, watching the deadly dust accumulate like snow that would never melt, like stars ground up and stored against the coming darkness. The other enslaved workers began to notice a change in her, a terrible clarity in her eyes, as if she had looked through the veil between this world and the next, and found the view to her liking. "That woman got something brewing," old Sarah whispered to young Marcus as they shucked corn in the evening light. "Something sharp as winter and twice as cold." But when pressed for details, Sarah would only shake her head and make the sign of the cross, muttering prayers in languages older than English, older than slavery, older than the pretty lies white folks told themselves about God's plan. The house itself seemed to sense the change. Floorboards creaked without footsteps. Doors swung open in still air. The master's hunting dogs whined and paced, sensing something their keen noses couldn't identify, but their wild hearts recognized, the scent of death approaching on silent paws. And still she ground her glass, night after night, until the powder filled her vial like captured moonlight, like pulverized dreams, like hope transformed into its own terrible opposite. The plan was both desperate and deliberate, born from a mind pushed beyond endurance, yet still capable of exquisite calculation. She would not run. Running was for those who still believed in escape. She would not beg. Begging was for those who still believed in mercy. She would serve justice in a porcelain cup, seasoned with years of accumulated pain and sweetened with the knowledge that sometimes the meek inherit the earth by burying those who would deny it to them. The morning came dressed in mist and magnolia blossoms, beautiful as any Virginia dawn had a right to be. The master's bedroom curtains glowed gold with sunrise as he stirred beneath imported silk sheets, unaware that this day would be measured not in hours, but in heartbeats, not in minutes, but in final breaths. She moved through her morning routine with the precision of ritual, each action choreographed by months of identical mornings that had led to this singular dawn. The kitchen fire was built and fed until it roared like a caged tiger. The coffee beans were ground fresh, good beans, expensive beans, beans that had traveled farther than most human souls ever would. The water was heated to the perfect temperature, not quite boiling, hot enough to extract every bitter truth from the dark grounds. The coffee pot was silver, inherited from the master's grandmother, polished to mirror brightness by hands that would never be reflected in its surface as equals. Steam rose from its spout like incense from an altar dedicated to gods who demanded sacrifice. She prepared the coffee exactly as he preferred, strong enough to wake the dead, dark enough to hide secrets, served in the bone china cup that had touched his lips every morning for 30 years. But this morning, as dawn light filtered through the kitchen windows like golden honey, She reached beneath the loose floorboard and retrieved her vial of glass powder. Her hands were steady as surgeon's tools, calm as still water, sure as sunrise. The powder poured into the coffee like sand into an hourglass, invisible against the dark liquid, tasteless as truth, deadly as justice too long delayed. She stirred, the mixture with a silver spoon, each circular motion a prayer to gods whose names had been forgotten, but whose hunger for balance remained eternal. The glass dissolved into invisibility, becoming one with the bitter brew, transformation complete and irreversible as the passage from slavery to freedom, from silence to speech, from victim to executioner. The master's footsteps echoed on the poi, marble stairs as he descended to his breakfast, each step a countdown to revelation. His morning coat was perfectly pressed, his hair silvered to perfection, his expression carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had never questioned his right to own other human souls. He took his place at the head of the dining table like a king claiming his throne, unaware that his kingdom had already been conquered by forces he couldn't see, wouldn't acknowledge, would never understand. She entered the dining room carrying the coffee service on a silver tray, her movements fluid as water, silent as shadows. The cup and saucer chimed gently as she set them before him, a sound like distant church bells, like wind chimes disturbed by phantom breezes, like crystal singing its own funeral song. The coffee was perfect, dark as midnight, aromatic as sin, hot as the fires that waited beyond the veil. Steam rose from the cup like the breath of judgment, curling in patterns that seemed almost alive, almost conscious, almost aware of the moment's terrible significance. The master reached for his newspaper with one hand and lifted the cup with the other, the motion automatic as breathing, thoughtless as cruelty, final as the closing of a coffin lid. The first sip was like every morning's first sip, bitter, strong, familiar as his own heartbeat. The second sip went down smooth as silk, warm as blood, deceptive as promises made by powerful men to powerless women. The third sip caught in his throat, not because of any taste, glass ground fine enough leaves no trace on the tongue, but because somewhere deep in his body, alarm bells were beginning to ring. She watched from the corner where shadows pooled. Like spilled ink, her face a mask of servile attention, her eyes windows into storms that had been gathering for decades. He drank his coffee and read his newspaper, king of his diminishing kingdom, master of his final morning, oblivious to the revolution brewing in his bloodstream, like tea steeped too long, like justice served cold, like death measured by teaspoons. The glass worked slowly, as she had known it would. There would be no sudden collapse, no dramatic clutching of chest, no operatic death scene to satisfy the bloodthirsty or terrify the innocent. Instead, there would be time. Time for him to feel the first stirrings of discomfort. Time to wonder why his throat felt raw. Time to taste copper on his tongue like pennies, like blood, like the flavor of chickens coming home to roost. By noon, the master was coughing. By afternoon, there was blood in his handkerchief, bright red droplets like roses blooming on white linen, like confession written in the body's own ink. By evening, he was doubled over with pain that started in his stomach and radiated outward, like cracks spreading through glass, like fault lines opening in the bedrock of his certainty. The doctor was summoned, a nervous little man with spectacles and theories, who prodded and listened and prescribed laudanum for the pain while admitting he'd never seen symptoms quite like these. The master's throat was torn as if he'd swallowed razors. His stomach lining was shredded like paper caught in a whirlwind. His body was betraying him from the inside out, turning against itself with microscopic violence that mirrored the larger violence he had authored for decades. It's as if something sharp is cutting him apart, piece by piece, the doctor confided to the master's brother, who had ridden hard from Richmond when word reached him of the mysterious illness. Something I cannot see, cannot extract, cannot heal. He shook his head like a man confronting mysteries beyond his comprehension, unaware that sometimes the most invisible poisons are the most deadly, that sometimes justice comes ground fine, as flour stirred into morning coffee served with a smile. The household held its breath as the master's condition worsened. His screams echoed through halls that had heard screams before, but never from his lips, never from his throat, never torn from his body by pain he couldn't understand or control or purchase his way out of. The irony was not lost on those who had eyes to see. A man who had prided himself on strength, on dominance, on the absolute control of others, undone by something as fragile as glass, as invisible as the humanity he had refused to acknowledge in those he owned. She continued her duties with mechanical precision, emptying his chamber pot, changing his blood-stained sheets, bringing him water he couldn't keep down and food he couldn't swallow. If anyone noticed the absence of sorrow in her eyes, they said nothing. If anyone remarked on the small smile that sometimes touched her lips when she thought no one was looking, they kept such observations to themselves. In a house where survival depended on blindness to inconvenient truths, she had become invisible in plain sight, a ghost haunting her own revenge. The master lingered for 3 days, 3 nights of agony that gave him time to contemplate mortality, to feel his body failing him in ways he had never imagined possible. Perhaps in those final hours, as glass continued its microscopic work of destruction, he understood something about helplessness, about being at the mercy of forces beyond his control. Perhaps he tasted, just for a moment, the bitter brew of powerlessness that had been daily bread for so many others. Perhaps not. The dead keep their revelations to themselves. When the authorities arrived to investigate the mysterious death, they found a household gripped by fear and whispered speculation. Poison was suspected naturally. What else could cause such specific, devastating internal injuries? The sheriff was a practical man with a mustache like a caterpillar and eyes like chips of granite, unimpressed by wealth or social standing, but determined to find answers that would satisfy the powerful men who demanded them. The questioning began in the grand parlor, where portraits of dead Whitmores gazed down from gilt frames with expressions of perpetual disapproval. Every member of the household was interrogated, from the overseer with his guilty conscience, and nervous ticks to the kitchen staff with their downcast eyes and carefully neutral faces. Suspicion fell first on those with obvious motives: creditors, rivals, business partners who might benefit from the master's death. But when they came to her, sitting in the corner of the kitchen like a shadow made flesh, the questions took on a different character. Here was someone with access to his food, his drink, his most private moments. Here was someone who moved through his world invisible as air, trusted as furniture, overlooked as wallpaper. The sheriff studied her with eyes that had seen too much of human nature's darker corners, looking for tells, for cracks in her composure, for the guilt that surely must be written somewhere on her face. "You prepared his coffee every morning," the sheriff stated, his voice carrying the weight of accusation. She nodded, her eyes downcast in the manner of one who had learned that direct eye contact with white authority was a luxury she could not afford. "Did you notice anything unusual about his behavior in the days before his death? Any enemies? Any threats?" Her voice, when she spoke, was soft as whispered prayers, careful as footsteps on thin ice. "Master Whitmore was always particular about his coffee, sir. Strong and black, no sugar, no cream. Same as every morning for all the years I served him." The truth and the lie were inseparable, woven together like threads in a tapestry depicting scenes of suffering and redemption. Other enslaved workers were questioned, but their responses were uniformly unhelpful, a chorus of "no, sir," and "don't." "Know nothing about that, sir." "And Master was always good to us, sir." The lies came easy as breathing, protective as prayer, unified as soldiers closing ranks against a common enemy. In the quarters that night, when white ears couldn't hear, there might have been whispers of admiration, of justice served cold, of David finding his stone and Goliath finally falling. But in the harsh light of official investigation, they saw nothing, knew nothing, suspected nothing. The doctor performed what passed for an autopsy in those days, finding the master's internal organs lacerated beyond repair, but unable to identify the cause. There was no trace of known poisons in his system, no evidence of conventional toxins that might explain such systematic internal destruction. "It's as if he swallowed broken glass," the doctor reported, unaware of how close he had come to literal truth. But that's impossible, of course. Glass would be visible, detectable, obvious. Days passed. Weeks crawled by like wounded animals seeking dark places to die. The investigation stalled in the face of inconvenient facts. No obvious motive. Among those who might plausibly commit such a crime, no evidence of conventional poison, no witness to any suspicious behavior. The sheriff filed his report with the reluctant conclusion that Cornelius Whitmore had died of unknown causes, possibly some rare disease that mimicked the effects of internal poisoning. The case was closed, not because it was solved, but because the living had other concerns and the dead make poor witnesses. But in the slave quarters, where justice was a luxury and truth a dangerous commodity, a different trial was taking place. Night after night, voices whispered in the darkness, weighing evidence that would never see a courtroom, deliberating on questions that had no legal answers. Was this murder or divine intervention? Was this revenge or righteousness? Was this woman a killer or an angel of judgment finally arrived to balance scales that had been weighted against the innocent for too long? The answer, like so many truths about slavery, depended on who was asking and who was listening. To the authorities, she remained a person without agency, incapable of such sophisticated planning, such patient execution, such perfect crime. To her fellow sufferers, she had become something else, a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the most powerless could find ways to reclaim power, that silence could be a weapon sharper than any blade. As autumn painted the Virginia countryside, in shades of blood and gold, strange things began to happen around the Whitmore plantation. The master's coffee cup, cleaned and returned to the china cabinet, would occasionally be found shattered on the floor, despite locked cabinets and still air. Dogs refused to enter the dining room where he had taken his final meals. Visitors complained of strange tastes in their coffee, bitter notes that lingered long after the last drop was consumed. The plantation continued to operate, managed now by overseers and distant relatives, but its atmosphere had changed. The house felt different, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted, as if something that had pressed down on the very foundations had finally been removed. Some said you could hear laughter in the halls now, soft and musical, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. And she? She moved through the changing household like smoke, like memory, like a ghost who had not yet realized she was dead. Some mornings, she still prepared coffee out of habit, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. Some evenings, she still waited for the master's bell to summon her to duties that would never come again. Some nights, she dreamed of glass grinding, against stone, of justice served in porcelain cups, of freedom that tasted like bitter coffee and smelled like magnolia blossoms blooming over graves. But as winter approached and the investigation faded into bureaucratic memory, whispers began to circulate about her disappearance. One morning, her narrow bed was empty. Her few possessions, a torn shawl, a prayer book with pages missing, a small glass vial that might once have held medicine, were gone as if they had never existed. The other workers claimed ignorance, naturally. No one had seen her leave. No one knew where she might have gone. No one could say whether she had slipped away in the night like smoke dissipating or simply faded into the walls like so many others who had lived and died in that house without leaving traces of their existence. The official records fell silent about her fate, as they had been silent about her life, as they were silent about the lives of countless others who had moved through history without names, without acknowledgement, without the dignity of being remembered. Had she escaped into the woods, following stars toward a freedom she had finally made possible for herself? Had she vanished into folklore, becoming one of those mysterious figures who drift through mountain hollers and river bottoms, helping others find paths toward liberation? Or had she met a quiet end, executed without trial or record, buried in unmarked ground like so many who had dared to resist? The truth, like so many truths about that time and place, dissolved into legend, into whispered stories passed from generation to generation, like recipes for survival. Some said she had made her way north, following the Underground Railroad to Canada, where she lived to old age surrounded by grandchildren who never knew their grandmother had once served death in a coffee cup. Others claimed she had died fighting, cut down while running toward freedom, her blood watering the Virginia soil like rain on ground, too long parched by injustice. But the most persistent legend, the one that survived in kitchens and quarters, in churches and cotton fields, was different. They said she had simply walked away one morning, disappearing like mist at sunrise, like the memory of dreams upon waking, like hope that finally transforms itself into action. They said she had become something more than human, a spirit of justice that moved through the South like a whispered promise, appearing whenever the powerful grew too comfortable in their cruelty, whenever the scales of justice needed rebalancing by invisible hands. And in the great house that had once belonged to Cornelius Whitmore, now empty of his presence but somehow fuller for his absence, strange phenomena continued to manifest. Visitors reported the persistent smell of coffee in rooms where no coffee had been brewed. Crystal glasses would develop mysterious cracks overnight, spiderwebbing into patterns that resembled fractured stars, shattered dreams, broken promises finally set free. Most unnervingly, the bone china coffee cup, the very cup that had delivered death dressed as morning ritual, could never be properly cleaned. No matter how vigorously servants scrubbed, there always remained a residue that caught the light like ground glass, like powdered diamonds, like justice crystallized into visible form. Years passed. The plantation changed hands, then changed again, then was finally abandoned to the vines and weather and the patient work of time reclaiming what humanity had tried to tame. The great house slowly crumbled, its white columns stained by rain, and its marble floors cracked by roots that pushed up from below like the buried past demanding acknowledgement. But even as nature reclaimed the physical structure, the stories persisted, growing stronger with each telling, more vivid with each retelling, more true in their essential truth, even as their factual details blurred into myth. Travelers passing through that part of Virginia began to report strange experiences. Coffee that tasted inexplicably bitter, as if seasoned with tears, cups that shattered in their hands without cause. Dreams of a small, dark woman who moved through shadowy corridors with purpose that burned like cold fire, with justice that cut like broken glass. The locals learned to add extra sugar to their coffee, to hold their cups gently, to speak respectfully of the dead, especially the dead who had died without names, without acknowledgement, without the justice they had been denied in life. What does it mean to be free when freedom must be taken rather than granted? What does it mean to seek justice when the law itself is the instrument of oppression? What does it mean to find power when powerlessness has been your daily bread, your constant companion, your only inheritance from a world that has denied your very humanity? These questions lingered in the Virginia air like morning mist, like the smoke from fires that burn long after the flame is extinguished, like the echo of voices that spoke truth to power and paid the price for their honesty. They settled into the soil like bones, like memories, like seeds that would someday sprout into understanding that comes too late for the dead, but just in time for the living. Glass, after all, is both beautiful and deadly, transparent and invisible, fragile and capable of cutting to the bone. It can hold the light or shatter it into rainbows. It can protect what is precious or become the weapon that destroys what is corrupt. In the hands of the powerless, it becomes something else entirely, a metaphor for the clarity that comes with desperation, the terrible transparency of truth that can no longer be ignored, the sharp edges of justice that cut both ways. They say that on certain mornings in Virginia, when the mist rises from the rivers and the magnolias bloom with unusual intensity, you can still smell coffee brewing in houses where no one lives, can still hear the gentle clink of spoon against porcelain in rooms where no one stirs anything more substantial than memory. They say that sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear laughter, soft, musical, knowing, drifting through the morning air like smoke from fires that burn eternal, like the sound of justice finally served, like the whisper of freedom that tastes like bitter coffee and feels like broken glass ground fine as hope. And in every cup of coffee that carries unexpected bitterness, in every crystal glass that develops mysterious cracks, in every morning ritual that suddenly feels heavy with unspoken possibility, her story continues. Nameless but not forgotten, powerless but not defeated, silenced but not truly quiet. She lives on in every act of resistance disguised as servitude, every smile that masks revolution, every quiet moment when the oppressed remember that even the most invisible among us can find ways to make our presence felt. Some wounds never heal. Some cups never offer salvation. Some mornings taste of ground glass and justice served cold, one careful spoonful at a time, in the darkness before dawn, when the world holds its breath and waits for the reckoning that comes to all who mistake. Power for righteousness, ownership for love, silence for consent. The coffee grows cold. The cup sits empty. The story remains crystalline and cutting, beautiful and terrible, as eternal as the morning light that reveals all secrets and as persistent as the human hunger for justice that no amount of power can ever fully satisfy or permanently deny.